So I want to start talking now about chapter 3 of Derrida's book, Rogues, well, of the first essay, The Reason of the Strongest, called The Other of Democracy, and then continues, the by turns, alternative and alternation. So there are actually a number of things happening in that title. I'm not going to worry about them now, but I imagine I will come back to discuss them a bit more later. But let's just start with the first part of the title, The Other of Democracy. I guess there are two things to hold in mind then. That at its core, as I was trying to say last time, much of the idea of democracy is the idea of inclusion, in the sense that it's supposed to be, the people governing themselves, and so you want it to be the people, not some isolated body. You want it to be the people that's making their own decisions. And so anytime you have, just some isolated group making decisions, well, then they're imposing their will on others. And you want to say, no. We want people to be able to decide for themselves. So you want to be able to include everyone. So that's on the one hand, democracy seems to have built into it something like this idea of universal inclusion. But on the other hand, you precisely want to differentiate democracy from some other thing someone might do, as I just did in trying to present it, right? Some other smaller group might want to take charge and rule. Then you would say, no, that's not democracy. So democracy, interestingly then, both involves the notion of total inclusion, and it involves the notion of excluding some other forms of government. Now, initially, that might not look like such a big deal. Of course, one form of government excludes another form of government. But now remember that any other form of government is something that, some people want to have. So if you're excluding that other form of government, you are excluding the will and the desires of those people who want that. So you can't exclude another form of government without excluding a lot of people, in the sense that you're not going to represent their views or let them be included. So there is therefore a troubling tension at the very heart of democracy, that it seems to be defined simultaneously by the notions of inclusion and exclusion, and in ways that don't just, it's not like you can say, we'll include some things and exclude another. It's defined by universal inclusion, and therefore not allowed to exclude, and it relies on exclusion. And it's not just a silly little conceptual point. It's an issue that bothers people all the time when they want to know, like, should we allow Nazis to speak? Aren't we supposed to hear every voice? It's constantly the case in any kind of democratic context. By democratic context, I mean a context in which people purport to be living from and advocating and defending democratic ideals. It's always an issue in those contexts that someone will say, well, if you're really going to be democratic, you have to include these people you want to exclude, right? And that basically means people with political views that differ from your own, which is to say that differ from the Democrats' views. So for that reason, then, it seems like democracy, in as much as it is supposed to be inclusive of all points of view, has to recognize as a legitimate part of itself the advocacy and the pursuit of political views that conflict with democracy, right? And so, in fact, that's why in Book 8 of the Republic, Derrida, I can't remember if he mentions this exact thing, although he talks quite a bit about Book 8 of the Republic in here. But in Book 8 of the Republic, Socrates says that at one point, that in going into a democracy, it's almost like going into a political marketplace where you can find every kind of constitution available for sale, right? All forms of political constitution or life or whatever are intrinsic to democracy. So democracy initially looks like one political form among many, and yet It's the political form that, in fact, has to include all those. So it both has to be a particular political form that excludes other political forms, and it has to be the universal political form that includes all of them. Again, as I said, you might hear these things and you might be able to follow well enough the point that I'm making, but you might say, yeah, that's kind of a logical game. Like, who cares? And if it were only a logical game, then we wouldn't care. Well, you might, but I wouldn't, and I don't think it would have much weight in the larger world. But the reason Derrida is pursuing this is because he's trying to show that it's not just a trivial little game or just a little amusing logical paradox, but that something about this is both integral to what democracy really has to mean, and is in part a kind of living, driving force in democratic political life all the time. But that's a little preamble, first of all, then, just on this notion of the other of democracy, just to get you to thinking about the idea that democracy, in order to seemingly to have any meaning, has to differentiate it from something else. So there has to be an other to democracy. But then the very notion of democracy is, it seems that it has to include that thing it tried to exclude. And so democracy is in a way defined by this troubling double direction. It's got to be working to include, and it can only do that by working to exclude. Something like that. You'll see that issue is going to come up in a number of ways here. So that's the first one. That's the conceptual sort of version of the other of democracy, where the other means, the one I'm giving first is the other as the other political forms, the exclusion of which is integral to the very defining of what one means by democracy. But now, on the other hand, and this, again, we'll pick up on a point I already made, but it will take it in a slightly different direction. On the other hand, democracy is, the representation of the demos, the people, the population, right? So, as I said before, when you go for this as opposed to that, whether it's a political view as opposed to another, or a policy as opposed to another, those options you're choosing between really are reflective of bodies of people. You're selecting the view of this group of people and opposing the group of that group of people, right? So, and indeed, democracy is always going to be built around disagreements, even if it's not about whether to be democratic or not in that simple and basic sense. People are going to disagree about whether we should start construction on the new motorway this week or next week, or whether we should give the funds to this or that, or whether, whatever it is, any decision is going to be built around the fact that a lot of people have different views, and that group has to somehow come to a collective decision. And that's always going to be the issue. And that, again, is really a driving thing here, right? That the whole idea is a decision has to be come to out of a context that of initially multiplicity and disagreement. You got to end up with a single agreement, so to speak, out of a multiplicity of disagreement. But of course, except in the smallest and rarest contexts, it's not going to be the case that everybody turns around and agrees in any simple sense. And that means the process of coming to decision is going to be a process of selection. At some level, you're going to select which people get to decide. A familiar example of that is voting, where you end up saying the majority will decide. And so what that means is the vote of these people carries the day, and the vote of these people is excluded. And interestingly, we treat that as exclusion. We say as inclusion. We say we included everybody in the decision, which was a decision in which the views of all those people were excluded. So in what sense could we call that inclusion? Well, we could call it inclusion at some level, not at every level, but at some level, we could call it inclusion if all of those people themselves basically agreed that voting was a proper procedure to follow. And so therefore they would accept that they were all included in the procedure, and that inclusion in the procedure is what makes legitimate the results, even if the results end up excluding one group or another. I imagine we'll have opportunity to return to that issue in a little while. But what I wanted to get at there was just this idea that whether it's by voting or just about any other means, the move from essentially multiplicity to decision is going to be a kind of selection and therefore a kind of exclusion. And that means you're going to be deciding which group of people essentially got to decide and which group of people therefore was excluded. Their view isn't the one that carried the day, though they did were involved acceptably in the procedure. So for that reason, democracy as a political form, a political decision-making system, can't be separated from the issue of basically the marking out of groups, right? And this one becomes, this group are the ones that carried the day and these ones didn't, right? So in its ongoing functioning, the democracy is in a way ongoingly differentiating groups of people. And indeed, that happened already even before that process of decision making we just talked about, because we said, okay, everybody was there voting and they got this decision, and that meant these people's vote is the one that won and these people's vote is the one that lost. But going back to the beginning when you said everybody was voting, that already had some exclusionary decision making happening behind it, because when everybody voted, you already made a few exclusionary decisions to let that happen. Namely, you said, well, only the people in Canada get to vote on this decision, not the people in America, not the people in Brunei, not the people in Italy, right? You already said, oh, this is a vote for this country. So you'd already made a kind of demographic differentiation, right? And then, of course, within Canada, which is the example I was using because I'm here, but I could have picked anywhere that does that. You also, it's not even everybody in Canada who voted because, well, some of those people don't have voting rights. And it could be for a variety of reasons. It could be in any given country or wherever the exclusionary voting body, the larger space is defined as, you could decide, well, we're not going to let prisoners in penitentiaries vote. You might decide that. You might not decide that, but you might. Or you might decide we're not going to let women vote. Or you almost certainly are going to decide we're not going to let babies vote. Are you going to let 5-year-olds vote? No. 10-year-olds? No. 15-year-olds? No. When? When are you going to start? And at some point you're going to have to make a decision that here is the point when you get included. Maybe it's going to be when you're 18, maybe it's 16, maybe it's 21. But there again, just to establish that procedure, you had to make a decision about who you were going to include and who you were not. And that one wasn't decided by voting, obviously, since you were using this to establish the decision about voting. And then even there, let's think again. When you're doing that kind of voting that we're talking about, you're thinking about a whole bunch of individuals. But that's a decision too. It's a decision about it. That's already a decision about how to understand the organization and grouping of peoples, right? So you say, we're going to count individuals. But there are other ways you could do that. And of course, you will pretty quickly recognize that we do this all the time in normal voting. But you could say, for example, we're going to vote by family. Or you could say we're going to vote by neighborhood. Or you could say we're going to vote by city. Now, in fact, that does happen. It's like certainly, for example, if you think about things like the Electoral College in the United States or something, the vote is done by a vote represents something much bigger and much different from an individual person, right? And consequently, you could count up all the votes of individual people, and that wouldn't be the same. That the breakdown of that wouldn't be the same as the breakdown of the electoral college votes, for example, in the United States, or in general in the city. Like in many, certainly North American cities and elsewhere, the city has already been divided up into voting districts. And so maybe you're in Ward 13 or something like that. And so in your ward, there may be what would they be? A Christian Democrat and a National Front and a Social Democrat and a Republican and a Communist. There are all these people who themselves claim allegiance to different parties, and there's a candidate from each of those running on the ballot. Individual people go and vote, true enough, and you end up counting the votes, and you end up deciding that in this context the Communist Party member got the most votes, though not a majority because there's so many people running that the vote got split up all over the place. But you end up counting those things and saying, okay, this one got the most, so this person wins. But so now your ward has selected the Communist Party member, but the other ward over there selected a Christian Democrat, and the other ward over there selected a Social Democrat or something like that. Now each of those people, the elected Communist Party member, the elected Christian Democrat Party member, the elected Social Democratic Party member, are all going to go to some other thing, a parliament or whatever, and they're going to vote. And each of them is going to get one vote, but each of them is effectively voting on behalf of that ward. So now there you're counting single voices of those voting people, but in a way you're also counting people by wards, not by individuals. And you can think of other things like that too. You might think there's good reason for that. Maybe, why do people make those decisions in the first place? Well, it might be because cities have different interests from farm communities, and you want the farming voice or vote as such to be represented, and you want the city vote as such to be represented. Or it may be that you want to have distinctive people elected by black voters or by Native American voters, because you might think these are constituencies that should have a voice, a vote. And so you might not want to just mush everybody together, but you might want to say, we got to make these decisions first because we have to realize these are the relevant issues that should be involved in decision making. But so then just to wrap up this thing I was saying, my point was that even to get into that voting process, you have to have already decided how you're going to count people, how you're going to group them. Like you're going to have to ask, what's the voting unit? And it's not obvious what a correct answer is. So, of course, it's common in many situations to have single people vote. It's common, but not universal, of course. But it's common to have single people vote. But it's not like that's what God handed down as the rule about voting. That was a decision about how to decide, how to count people, how to group them. It was already a demographic decision. It was a decision that people function as individuals, not as communities, not as classes, not as societies, not as ethnic groups. Right? So you said, nope, the reality of a person is that you're a discrete individual. And that's not a neutral claim. That's a heavily interpretive claim about human beings. And so that decision about how to divide up and decide about people already had to be made before the voting procedure got set in motion. Right? So what I'm trying to get at then is for you to see in various ways how, just using voting as the example, but we could think of other things too, but in various ways how the notion of democracy, some way of getting from multiplicity to decision, that process of getting to decision can't really be separated from, interpretive decisions about how to slice up humanity. As Derrida says at one point in here, how to count. And that's why he says on 39, if one thus takes into account the link between the democratic and the demographic, if one counts, But so the point is, the demographic and the democratic are always in a way linked. That is to say, democracy is always a way of marking out the distributions and distinctions of people, different kinds of people. That's always a matter, in the sense I was giving, of counting. So that's inherent to the very meaning of what democracy is. So I wanted to start there. So with this, so I started with with this theme of the other of democracy, I wanted to give first this sort of conceptual thing that democracy must exclude, in a certain sense, other forms of government, and yet at the same time it also has to include them. And then I wanted to move on to a second one that says democracy must, in a way, translate into demographic distinctions and counting. I already mentioned at the beginning that any excluded position would also mean excluding a group of people, and I want to bring that point around now, sort of the other way around. And this will be the last point I want to make in this first small segment, and we're really just going through the first 2 pages here of chapter 3. In our world now that we live in, we do live, you might say, under a regime of democracy, by which I mean it's pretty pervasively, almost universally the case that we, by which I mean the official voice of virtually everybody, have accepted that democracy is the right thing, that democracy is what the political world should be. And maybe that's true. But whether it's true or not that democracy is or should be that thing, it's bordering on unheard of for someone to challenge that, to disagree with that. People do it in jest, of course, or trying to be colorful or whatever. But at the level of real political analysis and real political thought, that's almost like the reflex of everybody. So we live in a democratic culture in the sense that we, broadly speaking, live with the belief that democracy is the right thing. And so that's why Derrida makes this point. I think this essay is from 2002, something like that. And he says at that point that, this is at the bottom of page 28, let me underscore this. In the modern world, the only regimes that do not fashion themselves to be democratic, the only regimes that don't say about themselves, we're democracies, right? The only ones that do not present themselves as democratic, unless I am mistaken, are statutorily linked to the Muslim faith or creed. Saudi Arabia, an absolute monarchy, would be a spectacular example of this, ... On the other hand, all the nation states linked, if not in their constitution, at least in their culture, with other religions aren't like that. So he says the ones linked to a Jewish faith, there's only one, Israel, or the ones linked to Christianity, which are so numerous that you can't even list them. And there's a point to be made about that, which we may or may not get to. Those all claim themselves to be democracies. He says, also the majority of post-colonial nation states with a mixed religious culture in Africa or in Asia present themselves today as democracy. So he mentions Judaism and Christianity. Here he doesn't mention other religions, but he could, and especially in India and China, Hinduism and I guess Confucianism more than anything else. But these places all say about themselves they're democracies, right? So it's like the whole world has to say this, with a couple of exceptions. Saudi Arabia, and a few other officially Muslim states that call themselves monarchies in one way or another, and say that they're not republics or democracies or anything like that. So, I think that's still more or less true in 2020. He doesn't mention the Vatican, which is a small place. I don't even know if it's properly called a state. It's a separate, I don't know exactly how those words work. It's certainly a separate political entity. It's a city. But it's it's the guy who runs the Catholic Church, and that's not a democracy and doesn't claim to be. So that would be another one. And there are maybe a couple other small ones. But basically, I think the thing he says is right, that if we ask what is the other to democracy, you'll look around the world and you'll have a hard time finding it at one level, because everybody says we're a democracy. Interestingly, these Muslim kingdoms claim not to be. So he says that's actually a pretty interesting thing, that there is a place, that's one of the few places you can turn to for a kind of at some level in opposition to this universal sweeping thing, which is democracy. Now, that might look to you to be a bad thing. You might say, democracy is great, so we don't want things that oppose it. Maybe. But we can also ask, so on the one hand, we start off saying democracy has to have another, but then on the other hand, we can say, can it even have another? And there might be something a little troubling about a reality that can't acknowledge anything that's other to itself. Right there, you might think this is something that looks at anything else, and all it can see is a mirror. All it can see is its own thing. Like you might have met somebody who talks like that. Like no matter what you say, all they hear is their own opinion. But you might think there would be something troubling about democracy or anything else if it couldn't have another, if no alternative were possible. Right? Again, go back to the very notion of democracy. Didn't we want it to be about debate, about including other people's points of view? So initially, when I set off this thing about the other democracy, probably you think, oh yeah, democracy has to exclude tyranny and so on, and that's a good thing. We don't want it to have tyranny, and so therefore sometimes you think, we don't want to let the people who advocate tyranny and fascism and whatever else come to speak at our campus, and then somebody complains, you're not being democratic, and you think, darn, that's a trouble. But there you think you want to be able to exclude that other voice. But then on the other hand, from the angle I'm bringing up now, you might think, well, we actually want a situation in which people who speak on behalf of what you don't want to hear are allowed in. That's kind of what we mean by democracy. And here it's going back to that thing about where I was sort of pursuing this demography issue, right? That if the whole idea of democracy is that it keeps excluding people by its decisions because it's going to select the view of this group and not that, then it seems like there is a constant issue of whether that thing that you were excluded is actually going to have any say in what happens, or whether it's just going to be a situation where you only deal with the things that are like you. You only deal with the winning side. Right? And so there you might think, maybe there is actually something kind of interesting about a voice that can speak against democracy. At this point, I'm just trying to raise a couple of provocative ideas and just to get you to think through a little bit about what these sort of issues of inclusiveness seem to mean when you translate them into the realities of making decisions and so on. And then so I'm just going to, as I said, I'm just going to end with this point where he says then, it's interesting to notice that it is only these Muslim states that in a way take a stand against democracy. And that turns out also to be a demographic point, and in a different sense, and that's what he goes on to say, because taking a stand against democracy, again, isn't just a theoretical stance. In this case, it amounts to, at a certain level, a stance against the West, or more exactly against America. Right? In as much as these democratic decisions can't be separated from democratic groups, the broad advocacy of democracy and the policies brought forward in its name are largely associated with the overwhelmingly powerful position in the world of the United States. And so to oppose democracy and to oppose America or Americanism aren't easily separable. And so there again, then you might think, why might you be interested in an other to democracy in a positive sense? Maybe there are things about the reality of Americanism that are troubling that you might want to oppose. So I'm going to stop there, but I just wanted to take us through those first. Well, I guess it's the first three paragraphs of this chapter, just to introduce some of these things about democracy, and get you thinking about this notion of the other to democracy and the democratic and the demographic, and to think about why that might matter and why it might mean something. So we're going to come back next time and we're going to go through a series of 3 points he makes that he draws out of a particular story about an Algerian election and coup, more or less, in 1992. So that's what we're going to turn to next. But there we've got to start with chapter 3.